The desert wind swept dust and regret through Whispering Rock, New Mexico. As Thomas read Elk, his body a road map of 58 hard years, sat beside his rusted 1971 camper. It was 1985, and after 4 decades of a search that had become the defining rhythm of his life, he had stopped here, tired, broken, and clinging to memories as thin as smoke. Thomas, though his birth name was Ashki Yaji and the boarding school had christened him Tommy, spread the yellowed newspaper across his lap with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. 40 years old this paper was, but he treated it as if it were printed yesterday. The headline read, "Indian Boarding Schools Forging America's Bright Future." Below it, a photograph that had haunted his dreams for 4 decades. 3 young girls sat on the wooden porch steps of a small chapel, their dark hair braided neatly, their white cotton dresses pressed and cleaned for the cameras. Behind them, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, stood a priest in black robes holding a Bible. Thomas knew every detail. The way Sarah's hands were folded primly in her lap. How Naomi's left shoulder tilted slightly from an old injury. The serious, almost stern expression on little Eva's face that made her look older than her 8 years. Those weren't their real names, of course. The boarding school had stripped those away along with everything else. Sarah had been born Nosley. She flows around, their grandmother's choice, because the child had been born during the spring floods. Naomi was Alisi. She is precious. And Ava was Ayana, joy. They had been his baby sisters, torn from their family in Cottonwood Bluffs when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came with their papers, their promises, and their lies. Thomas took a long pull from his beer, letting the bitter liquid wash down the even more bitter memories. He had been 14 when they came for the 4 of them, using their father's arrest as justification. Their father had resisted when government officials tried to seize their ancestral lands, a futile act of defiance that landed him in prison. Their mother had died giving birth to Ayana, leaving the children vulnerable to the federal assimilation policy that swept through Indian country like a plague. Wards of the state, they'd called them, as if being made orphans was some kind of gift. St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school had been their prison. Boys and girls were kept strictly separated, meaning Thomas rarely saw his sisters except during mandatory morning mass and evening devotions. Even then, speaking to them in Diné was forbidden, punishable by days locked in the basement, or worse, the beatings that left marks hidden beneath their uniforms. But the worst day, the day that still woke him in cold sweats, had been in 1945 when he was 18. The school had been preparing for weeks for a press visit. Thomas remembered how they had lined up the children like products in a store window, the youngest placed prominently. His sisters had been chosen specifically for the photo session because of what the priest called their innocent beauty and their obvious fear, which the newspapers would interpret as reverence. The reporters had come with their bulky cameras and notepads, asking scripted questions about gratitude and salvation. They had taken dozens of photographs, including the one now spread across Thomas's lap. The next day, his sisters were gone. He realized it at morning mass when their usual spots were empty. By evening devotions, panic had set in. He approached the guardians, but they refused to answer, beating him for his insolence and locking him in the basement for 3 days. "Forget you ever had sisters," they told him. But Thomas couldn't forget. When the beatings intensified and no information came, he escaped. At 18, he was technically an adult, and the school's search lasted only a few days. There were no missing child flyers, no real police investigation. Just the quiet understanding that one more Indian boy had disappeared into the vast American landscape, and no one in authority particularly cared. For 40 years he had wandered the Southwest in his camper, showing that newspaper photograph to anyone who would look. He survived on odd jobs, his life a testament to impermanence. Whispering Rock had been his home for the last decade, not because he'd found any trace of his sisters, but because he'd finally given up. The town was dying just like he was. The beer bottle made a hollow sound as the last drops disappeared. Thomas cursed, folding the newspaper carefully and placing it back on the passenger seat. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine coughing to life. The liquor store was only 10 minutes away. The bell above the door chimed as Tommy entered, and Marta Dane looked up with a smile that held genuine warmth. She was in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that had seen enough of life to understand suffering without judgment. "Tommy," she said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "Let me guess. The beer ran out again." He managed a weak smile. Marta was one of the few people who treated him like a human being. "You know me too well, Marta." He selected 6 bottles and carried them to the counter. As he reached for his wallet, his heart sank. The crumpled bills amounted to less than half of what he needed. Marta watched him count and recount the bills. "Tommy," she said gently, "you look sick and tired. When was the last time you had a real meal?" He shrugged, embarrassed. "Money's tight, I'll come back." But Marta leaned forward. "I know this isn't easy for you, what you're dealing with. I've seen the newspaper you carry, seen the pain in your eyes. Maybe you could come to church with me this Sunday. You look like you could use it." His first instinct was to refuse. Church wasn't a place for someone like him. "I'm not religious, Marta. I don't think your God would want me there." But Marta's eyes sparkled. "Tell you what, if you come to church with me and stay for the entire service, I'll buy you these 6 bottles of beer, and if you're still not convinced it helped, I'll throw in 2 extra. He looked at her skeptically. "You're bribing me with alcohol to go to church." Marta laughed. "Maybe. But sometimes God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes people need practical incentives." The offer was tempting. 8 bottles for sitting through one service seemed a reasonable trade. "Okay," he said finally, "but I'm doing this for the beer, not for salvation." "That's honest, at least," she smiled. "The service starts in 30 minutes at Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish. Follow the main road toward the mountains and turn left at the big wooden cross." Back in his camper, Tommy searched for something to wear. His cleanest t-shirt was still stained, but it would have to do. He splashed water on his face, combed his graying hair with his fingers, and drove toward the church. A modest building with adobe walls. Marta appeared as soon as he stepped out. "Thank you for coming, Tommy," she said, linking her arm through his. "I think this might be exactly what you need." Inside, the afternoon light filtered through simple stained glass windows. Tommy slumped into a hard wooden pew, arms crossed, waiting for the service to end. The priest, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, approached the altar. "That's Father Murphy," Marta whispered. "Good man." Tommy nodded absently, but then something caught his attention. To the side of the altar stood a group of nuns. They wore austere black robes that reached the floor, their faces partially obscured. Most appeared to be indigenous women, their features familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. When the service was nearly concluded, Father Murphy made an announcement. "The sisters from the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna are visiting our church. They're here to offer healing revival prayers. Everyone who feels the need is invited to receive it." Marta nudged him. "You should approach them. It would be good for you." He shook his head, but as they began to leave, Father Murphy approached. "Marta, how good to see you. And who did you bring?" Marta introduced Tommy, and the priest extended a hand. As they talked, Tommy found himself opening up, confessing his struggles with alcohol, though he carefully avoided mentioning his sisters. The priest spoke quietly about the visiting nuns. The handmaid sisters of St. Dymphna live very solemn lives. They've taken vows of silence and celibacy. They don't interact with the public except during these annual visits. He gestured toward them. You don't even have to speak. Just write your prayer request on a form, light a candle, and put it in the box. They'll pray for those requests at their monastery. In a few weeks, they'll write replies on the back of the forms to deliver God's message. Tommy was intrigued. So the nuns will write exactly what God tells them? That's right, Father Murphy confirmed. Curiosity piqued, Tommy walked to the front. At a small table, he found a prayer form. His handwriting was shaky as he wrote his name and his request. Guided by a silent sister, he lit a candle, then approached the box where 5 nuns stood guard. Up close, he could see most did indeed have indigenous features. He looked at the nun standing closest and felt compelled to speak. If you're right about this, he said quietly, if your God is stronger than our traditional spirits, then he should be able to tell me where my 3 missing sisters are. If he does, I'll be a devoted Catholic for the rest of my life. None of the nuns smiled back, but he noticed their expressions shift subtly. As he turned to walk away, he glanced over his shoulder. He watched as the nun who had caught his attention lifted the heavy prayer box. She limped noticeably, favoring her right leg. When she reached a side door, a gust of wind caught her habit, causing it to flutter. For a moment, Tommy caught a clear glimpse of her left temple, and his heart nearly stopped. There, partially hidden, was a thick, raised scar. The sight hit him like a physical blow. Naomi had borne a scar in the same place, a memento from the day she had tried to protect little Eva from a nun wielding a wooden ruler. He started to call out, his mouth opening to form his sister's name, but the door closed with a soft click. The moment passed, leaving him frozen in the aisle, his mind reeling with the impossible possibility. Tommy walked back to Marta and Father Murphy. Sorry to keep you waiting, he said, his voice unsteady. I saw one of the nuns limping. It reminded me of something. Father Murphy's expression grew concerned. Are you all right? The moment had arrived. Father, I need to tell you something. I had 3 sisters, and they've been missing for 40 years. They were taken from St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school. He recounted the story of the press visit and their disappearance. Father Murphy placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. I cannot imagine the anguish you've carried. What guidance are you seeking? How do I forgive? Tommy asked, his voice cracking. The anger, the loss. I drink to forget, but it never goes away. I truly believe you should wait for God's answer to the prayer you just made, the priest said. Perhaps this is how God will finally speak to you. Father, can you tell me more about these nuns? Where is their monastery? The priest's demeanor shifted. The founder was Father Milford. His son, Father Milford II, continues the ministry now. I can't provide the monastery's location. The Handmaid Sisters are a very private, reclusive group. They operate a sanctuary for women in prayer and penance. No contact, no visitors. Tommy sensed there was more Father Murphy wasn't telling him. Marta stepped forward, breaking the silence. Well, Tommy, I think it's time I fulfill my side of our bargain. Back at the liquor store, Marta kept her promise, handing him 8 bottles. Try not to finish them all in one day, she said kindly. In his camper, he saw a piece of paper under his windshield wiper, a flyer for the Handmaid Sisters tour. He glanced at it, opened a beer, and drove past the church one last time. He saw the 5 nuns emerge and climb into a plain white van. Curiosity overwhelmed him. He decided to follow the van and see where these mysterious nuns actually lived. It was about 1 p.m. when he began following the van out of Whispering Rock. He stayed well back as they headed east into increasingly desolate terrain. After nearly an hour, he spotted a large compound surrounded by a chain-link fence, topped not with barbed wire but with what looked like prayer flags. A sturdy gate blocked the entrance. He pulled off the road, watching as the van approached the gate. A young Native American man emerged from a guardhouse, opened the gate, and allowed the van inside. From his concealed position, Tommy studied the compound. It looked more like a prison than a monastery. He remained hidden, his beer growing warm. He pulled out an old wooden cigar box that had traveled with him for decades. Inside were the fragments of his identity. A collection of brittle school photographs, his most precious possession, a piece of turquoise set in silver suspended from a leather cord. His father had made 4 identical pendants. He turned it over, tracing the engraved Navajo symbols on the back. Ashkiyaji, his real name. His contemplation was interrupted by the compound gate opening. A sedan drove out. As the gate swung wide, he saw 2 figures in black habits embracing in the courtyard. One was crying. A third figure in regular clothes appeared and firmly guided them back inside. Tommy frowned, disturbed. Why would nuns in a supposed sanctuary be crying? He slipped the turquoise pendant over his neck and walked to the gate. The young Navajo watchman stepped out. "You can't be here," he said firmly. "Private property." Tommy raised his hands peacefully. "I'm not looking for trouble, brother. I just want to know if this is the monastery." The watchman's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" Instead of answering, Tommy pulled the turquoise pendant from beneath his shirt. The watchman's expression changed as he recognized the traditional craftsmanship. "I can't help you much," the watchman said finally, his voice lower, "even though you're a brother. But if you want answers, you need to talk to Father Milford II directly. His office is in Santa Dolorosa. Follow this road east for about 30 miles. He glanced nervously toward the compound. "You need to leave now. This isn't a good place for an indigenous man to be hanging around." The drive to Santa Dolorosa took him through winding mountain roads. As he reached the outskirts, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him when he spotted weathered road signs bearing the town's previous name. Cielo Seco. He had been here 20 years ago. Back then he had met a kind researcher, Clyde Yazzie, who had been collecting plant samples. Tommy had been exploring a canyon when Clyde nearly fell into a chasm. Tommy had grabbed his arm, saving his life. He pushed the memory aside. He located the building he was looking for on a quiet residential street, a modest house with adobe walls. The same sedan that had left the compound was parked in front. He approached the door and knocked. It swung inward. The house was unlocked. "Hello?" he called out, stepping inside. That's when he noticed dirt streaks on the floor, long smears leading deeper into the house like someone had been dragged. They were accompanied by red scratches on the walls. The trail led to a back door partly open. Just outside, cut into the rock, was a set of stone stairs descending into an underground cellar. Then he heard sounds that made his blood run cold. A woman's voice crying and pleading, the crack of a whip, and a man's voice reciting biblical passages in a menacing tone. "The Lord shall punish the wicked. Discipline purifies the soul." He crept closer. Through the stone entrance, he could see flickering candlelight. The woman's cries became more desperate. This was a place of torture. He turned and ran, his hands shaking as he started his camper. He needed help. Tommy burst through the doors of the Santa Dolorosa police station. "I need to report a crime," he said breathlessly. "There's a woman being tortured in an underground cellar at Father Milford II's house." The older officer, a sheriff, looked him up and down with disdain. "Slow down, Chief, you smell like alcohol. I had 1 beer hours ago. There's a woman being hurt." "You're talking about Father Milford II, the sheriff interrupted, his face flushing with anger. He is one of the most respected men in this town. He wouldn't hurt a fly. He walked to a shelf and picked up a photograph. This is Father Milford II. Tommy's blood turned to ice. The face looking back at him was the same man from his newspaper clipping, the priest who had stood behind his sisters 40 years ago. "Leave this town and don't come back," the sheriff warned. "If you make another crazy accusation, I'll have you detained." Tommy left, his hands trembling. The local authorities were useless. He found a payphone and from a worn address book dialed the number for Clyde Yazzie. "Clyde, this is Tommy, Thomas Red Elk. I'm not sure if you remember me." "Tommy, Jesus, where are you?" "I'm in Santa Dolorosa. I need your help. I saved your life 20 years ago. You told me if I ever needed anything, I could call. I'm calling in that debt." The line went quiet. "Where are you right now?" "Gas station on the main road." "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't move." Clyde arrived quickly. Tommy recounted the entire story. As he spoke, Clyde's expression changed from skepticism to alarm. "You're right. The local police won't help," Clyde said grimly. "We need to contact the Navajo Nation police. My cousin Joe works for them." He went inside to use the phone. 15 minutes later, he emerged. "Joe's on his way with a team. He said this kind of situation requires immediate investigation. He warned us to stay back and hide." They took Clyde's truck and drove back to Father Milford's house, parking where they could observe. "There," Clyde whispered. Two men in white linen garments were carrying a limp figure in a black habit toward the sedan. Dark stains were visible on their clothing. "Blood," Tommy breathed. Before they could load her into the vehicle, sirens echoed through the desert. Two marked units from the Navajo Nation police and one unmarked SUV appeared. A tall man stepped out of the lead vehicle. "That's Joe," Clyde said. Father Milford II emerged from the house, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "This is private property belonging to the Catholic Church. You have no jurisdiction here." "Sir, we have reports of assault involving tribal members," Joe responded firmly. When the tribal officers helped the injured woman, her condition was undeniable. Blood covered her face. Her habits were torn. Tommy stepped closer, his heart pounding. Despite the injuries, he recognized her. The scar on her left temple, the shape of her eyes. "Alisi," he called out using her Navajo name. "Naomi." The woman's head turned weakly. When her eyes focused on his face, she gasped. Breaking her vow of silence for the first time in 40 years, she spoke in halting Diné. "Brother, Ashki Yaji." "This is one of my 3 missing sisters," Tommy announced to the stunned group. Police searched the house and cellar, returning with Father Milford and his 2 assistants in handcuffs. As the priest was led away, he turned to Tommy with venomous hatred. "Your false ancestral gods are powerless against the true faith." The paramedics discovered fresh whip marks on Naomi's back, arms, and legs. As they administered IV fluids, Joe walked over. "We searched that chamber. It's disturbing. There's communion wine, but also a setup for traditional Navajo rituals. It's like he was mixing beliefs." Naomi, overhearing, nodded weakly. "He believed indigenous women had special connections to the spiritual world. He made us drink wine to receive divine messages. When we couldn't, he punished us." "What about Sarah and Ava?" Tommy asked desperately. "They're still at the monastery," Naomi said. "They learned to play his rules, faking messages to avoid punishment." "We're coordinating with state authorities to search the monastery," Joe assured him. "We'll bring them to you." Tommy climbed into the ambulance beside Naomi. At the regional medical center's waiting room, he sat with Clyde. An hour later, a nurse approached. "She's stable, ready for visitors." Before he could respond, Joe entered the hospital with two women in black habits. Sarah was the first to see him, her hand flying to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eva looked confused, then recognition dawned. They met in the center of the room. "Nasli," Tommy whispered, embracing Sarah. "Ayana," he said to Eva. "Ashki Yaji," Sarah replied through her tears. They found Naomi sitting up in bed, fragile but alert. "I can't believe this day has come," she whispered as they gathered around her. "You received your answered prayer, Tommy," Naomi said, squeezing his hand. "Not in words on paper, but in action." As the four siblings sat together, 40 years of trauma finally beginning to heal, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. The profound peace that comes from answered prayers and hope for a future he never thought he would have.